Stan Gibilisco here, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1GV, Whiskey 1, Golf, Victor, or Good Vibrations if you prefer, doing a little bit of historical reminiscence. Vertizontal, that's the type of antenna that you see diagrammed here. In the house that I lived in around 1970, when I was in about 10th grade, and down here, this little space, this little black space down here was my radio shack, which we called the lab. The nerd cave I have today makes the lab look plain by comparison, but it was a fallout shelter from which RG8U coax ran out through the side of the house, up onto the roof, up through a television mast, guyed, as I remember, with nylon cord, to an antenna which I called the vertizontal. Now this was a strange antenna. It was before I learned anything about antenna theory. Each element was 8 feet long, and at first you might be led to believe that this would be a 10-meter ground plane. Well, would you ever be wrong? Because all 5 of these 8-foot elements were connected together to the center conductor of the coaxial cable running down into the shack, whilst the shield of the coax was simply left free. Now this antenna should not have worked under any circumstances on any band worth crap. But it did work fairly well, and I made a bunch of contacts, which isn't necessarily saying a whole lot, because you can make contacts with a dummy load if you have 200 watts. At that time, plate power input. My transmitter was a Drake T4X. My receiver was a Drake R4A, and my transmatch was called a Matchbox, a Johnson Matchbox. A lot of you may be old enough to remember those. It worked 10 through 80 meters. Back then we did not have any 12, 17, or 30 meter bands, but we did have a 160 meter band. And then Drake radios covered that band, 1.8 to 2 megahertz, just as it is today, but the Matchbox did not cover that band. So I just used the Matchbox to force feed this coax into these 5 8-foot elements, which must have radiated some RF because I made some contacts. Well, one day I got it into my head to just see what was going on 160 meters. So I bypassed the transmatch and just tuned this Drake set of radios. Beautiful set of radios back then, state-of-the-art, gorgeous pair of radios. Just fed them right into the coax. No transmatch, no nothing. Didn't pay any attention to the SWR. Completely irrelevant. At WA0 Ocean Kilo Victor in Rochester, Minnesota, circa 1970, where a 17-year-old nerd carried on his appurtenances, that's not the right word, is it? Atrocities in the lab. The fallout shelter. Back then, you know, we were still worried that the Russians might launch a bunch of missiles at us and blow us to smithereens. This was a fallout shelter where the whole family would have to live after the event. Not a very good way to live, but it was also our tornado shelter, and that it would be very effective for. Trouble is, when the house fell down around it, you'd probably never find your way out. You have to chop your way out. Never thought to keep a hatchet in the lab. But I did have a bunch of radios in there, an old Western Union teletype machine so heavy that it put dents in a tile floor laid on flat bare concrete, 300-pound thing that had survived a fire that burned the rest of the building to the ground. I tuned these radios up into this coax on 161 winter night, and lo and behold, I was making contacts all over the United States, and I was getting good signal reports. I don't know how long this stretch of coax was, including the 8 feet or so of extra radiating element. I didn't even try to feed the thing just center conductor only like a random wire. I just plugged that old coax right into the back of the T4X, tuned her up for CW in the lower part of the 160 meter band, and made all kinds of contacts. Now, by all technical purposes, this thing should not have worked, or it should have been just the worst possible 160 meter antenna short of a dummy load. But I made all kinds of contacts with 200 watts plate power input to a pair of 6 JB6 vacuum tubes in that Drake transmitter. I had an ICO electronic keyer, beautiful keyer, all vacuum tubes, and one of those Vibroplex keys. Oh, I still love those to this day, and they make them to this day. And I have one in the Nerd Cave right now. Why did this thing work? Murphy would say that it couldn't possibly. Even things that are supposed to work aren't supposed to work under Murphy's laws. But under the laws of ham radio, where every once in a while you get something that should not work but does. Murphy's law says if something can go wrong, it will. Ham radio's laws say if something might go right, try it and see. I did, and it worked great. One of the many ironies of ham radio that fascinate me to this day and keep me in this crazy, wild, wonderful hobby, art, and pastime. Stan Gibilisco, W1 Good Vibrations, saying 73 for now, and so long.